Are you ready?
Okay. Yeah, ready.
Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me along and allowing me a bit of time to talk about my favourite subject. I'm a little bit of a one-trick pony. I have focused a lot on DNA over the last few years. I'm going to talk primarily about the evidence, which I think is fairly cut and dried these days. It's very clear evidence that we have now about Native American ancestry and Polynesian ancestry. But I'm very happy to answer questions about my personal experience of going through the whole thing, of encountering the evidence. My story is online. It's been online for quite a while, including a couple of years when I was anonymous. I was just I was Simon in Oz. It took me 2 years to get the courage to finally put my name on. But this is back in almost.
What if we
just the internet was just taking off about 98, 97.
I think it would get a bigger feel with you.
So let's just launch straight into it. First of all, I'm just going to talk very briefly about what the Book of Mormon Geography is, okay, and the various options that are available. I'll talk a bit briefly about the technology, then I'll launch straight into the facts that we have, the things that we know, and they are facts. They're hard facts that we know about Native American ancestry, and I'll also mention Polynesian ancestry, and then I'll go through the implications of those facts for the different geography models that are out there, and then make some quick observations about what's going on at the moment. So these are really the only geographies that are worth talking about. This is the one we all believed when we were active members of the church. We believed Book of Mormon people colonised both the north and the western hemisphere, the Americas, and right into the Pacific. Particularly us here in Australia, we all believed that Polynesians were descended from people who'd sailed, Haygoth, and people who'd sailed away from the South American continent. And this has been believed by all members of the church, all leaders, effectively since Joseph Smith. But unbeknownst to most of us, for about the last 50 years, academics at Brigham Young University have known that this is all nonsense. They've known that. Based on the archaeological evidence. There is no archaeological evidence of Middle Eastern presence in the Americas. But what they believe is that a critical feature of the Book of Mormon is that the civilizations have to have a written language. And there is only one culture in the Americas that have a written language, and that's the Mayans. The Olmec preceded them. Olmec are the Jaredites, the Mayans are the Lehites. That's what the limited geography people have taught, and it's been believed by the vast majority of BYU apologists. But what happened is in about 2005, 2006, I actually was interviewed in I think it was Living Hope Ministries, a ministry in Brigham City, I think, in the US, in Utah. I was interviewed by this ministry, and I outlined the DNA evidence that we had available to us, and the responses of the limited geography crowd to the DNA evidence really shocked this guy, Rodney Meldrum. It just completely threw him to a spin. Now he is a fundamentalist, he's a creationist, and he could not believe that the sort of twisted interpretations of the Book of Mormon that were required to salvage it for the limited geography. He's also very, very pro-America. America is the promised land, and if you go back through the scriptures, it's really quite clear that Joseph Smith believed that the Book of Mormon events were on the northern hemisphere, North America. So this guy, I've watched this from day one, this guy, and he is now, I think, more popular, more well known than the limited geography crowd. And these two groups hate each other with as much hatred as I have ever experienced as an ex-Mormon. So it's really been fascinating. Of course, we have the true geography, and that is that Native Americans all came from Asia via the Bering Strait, and I'll talk briefly about that. And there is absolutely no reliable evidence of pre-Columbian Middle Eastern people arriving in the Americas, apart from the Norse. who aren't Middle Eastern. So yeah, no Middle Eastern. Okay. The North, there is some really interesting stuff about it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's turn to DNA. The two types of DNA that I will talk about today are nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. So, and they have quite distinct patterns of inheritance. Mitochondrial DNA was studied first because it's very cheap and it's the simplest technology that had been developed at the time. But now we can analyse the nuclear DNA. If you've heard of ancestry DNA, they study this, and they study about 700,000 DNA markers all the way across a person's genome to reveal amazing information. But this stuff is amazing for ancestry studies, so it's been used very often. So what mitochondrial DNA is, if you look at the nucleus, this is where the sperm comes in, the DNA from the male fertilises the egg, and you have the male and female DNA in here, but the mitochondrial DNA out here is always derived from the mother. Okay, so the mitochondrial DNA that you carry is derived from your mother. And it's a clear line, okay, all the way back along the maternal line. Whereas all of the other DNA in the nucleus, the nuclear DNA, comes from your parents, and the story was all over. All the answers were in with the mitochondrial DNA evidence. We knew about the Asian ancestry from that, but this is just giving us more resolution. It's much more fun, much more powerful. So when we talk about a DNA, the things we're talking about that identify and distinguish one person's DNA from another are what we call a DNA marker. So the vast majority of our DNA that we share is the same. 99.99% of the DNA of all of you in this room is the same as somebody else in the room. Okay, it's just these little tiny differences called markers that are used to distinguish. Very often these differences make absolutely no difference, but there'll be some that make difference to hair colour, eye colour, skin colour, height, all sorts of things. But for genealogical purposes, that doesn't really matter what they do. They're just very useful for distinguishing. In this case, if we're talking about nuclear DNA, this might be the chromosome that came from the mother, this might be the chromosome that came from the father. So, when we talk about mitochondrial DNA lineages and relatedness between individuals, it will only be at a few markers in the mitochondrial genome. So, and there are only 16,500 base pairs of DNA in the mitochondria. And that's why they studied it. The scientists studied it. It's such a small bit of DNA, and they knew every single base. They knew it intimately. 20, almost 30 years ago, I think it was about 30 years ago, they discovered the full sequence. 1980, yeah. So, but it took another 20 years to get the full human genome sequence. So, a few markers, probably I think it's around about, that's right, a few dozen markers on mitochondrial DNA can be used for ancestry research, whereas if you look at the entire genome, the genomic DNA, this represents all the chromosomes, and if your eyesight's really good, you'll see lots of little tiny white lines all along there. There are literally thousands and thousands of markers along the chromosomes, all the way along the chromosomes that can tell you that DNA came from Africa, that DNA came from the Middle East, that DNA came from Asia, Native American, all the way along. In this particular example, they've coloured the chromosomes according to where the DNA came from. If you look very carefully, I don't know if you can see it, you can see these odd pockets of brown chromosome, which came from these brown regions, or what do they call it? Native American, Asian, blue Europe, and then little bits of African pockets down here. So, but this is the most exciting stuff. This is where it's all happening at the moment. So, 700,000 markers. Of those, there might be about 30,000 markers that will, to a molecular scientist, they'll just scream out Native American. Those markers are found in Native Americans only, not in other people around the world. But there'll also be maybe 50,000 markers that would be screaming out Israelite, Jewish, Middle Eastern. So they've got all that sort of stuff mapped out very nicely. So it's very easy to distinguish where this DNA comes from. So let's just jump straight into what the evidence is, and I'll talk about the evidence in relation to the particular geographies were in existence, and here's the first one, the hemispheric geography. Now this is data that I came across back in probably around about 1990. We left the church in 98, so it was 1998. So as you can see very clearly, let me just run through this very quickly. So the scientists are not very exciting when it comes to naming DNA lineage families. Okay, A, B, C and D. The reason for that is that at the time they were doing the research on Native Americans, they were just starting to understand that there were DNA families. And they started classifying them, and the first group that they started classifying was Native Americans. This lineage was a little bit more confusing and took a little bit longer to work it out, what it was, and to discover it. And by the time they got to that one, they'd moved through the alphabet, so they'd gone through a whole bunch, H, J, K and all that sort of stuff for Europe, M, they'd gone through Asia, and so this one here cropped up. Now this is a fairly interesting one, and it features quite heavily in the debates because it's one that occurs outside of Asia. So it also occurs in Europe, but also in Asia. Whereas these other four lineages, the A, B, C and D, are just absolutely unambiguous. They're Asian lineages. So as you can imagine, this is what I knew back in 1998. The evidence that I was faced with, 99.6% of the DNA was absolutely not derived from the Middle East. This stuff here was, they'd find the occasional bit of European DNA or the occasional African lineage, and it always looked like this is just admixture. So in other words, there were plenty of Africans that migrated into the Americas 300 or 400 years ago, not long after Columbus arrived, and Europeans, and they brought in their mitochondrial DNA. So
This is post-Book of Mormon times, right?
yes,
yeah. This is modern, right? Yeah. This is right now. Right?
Yeah. So, but it's now possible to determine precisely where that DNA comes from, and using both mitochondrial DNA and genomic DNA sequencing. So this shows the distribution of the lineages just according to a pie chart. You can see here the colours for the different lineages. So you'll see that the A, B, C and D are also found all the way through the Americas. You'll notice that in Greenland it's just the A lineage. So there's quite a distinct pattern in the Americas. And they're all found in Asia, particularly in Central Asia. And that's where they came from. That's where they migrated from. So the X lineage, this orange one you'll notice, there's a very, very tiny sliver of the X lineage which you can't see in Central Asia. So they found it there, but it is also present in Europe. So Rodney Meldrum has built his entire hemispheric geography on the X lineage. That's complete rubbish. And while we're looking at pie charts, this is the result of the data that we have on Polynesians. So Polynesians are unrelated to Native Americans. This fits beautifully what the archaeologists knew from archaeology. The Lapita culture, the cultures that went into the Pacific, they came originally from Taiwan, they sailed down, they mixed with the populations in the islands, particularly when they reached New Guinea. So this is coastal New Guinea. You see quite a high proportion of these blue Polynesian lineages. Then they went out into the Pacific and then colonised widely. So and for those who are very observant, that's where they got to. The Polynesians were unbelievable sailors. So these stories you hear of Native Americans sailing to the Pacific are really just nonsense. If anyone did any sailing between America and the Pacific, it was Polynesians, and they would have gone there and gone back. In fact, there is evidence of that. So I'm pretty sure that the DNA it certainly completely exposed the church, and this is because their response was a very quiet change. You would all know, to the introduction of the Book of the Book of Mormon. Just a one-word change. It was very cleverly done, but all done very quietly, thinking that would solve the problem, but it doesn't really solve the problem. So the limited geography. It's been around for probably 50, they would probably argue it's been around for 150 years, but really it's probably the last 5 decades it's really been the dominant academic model. As I mentioned before, they focused on the Maya, but there's some really interesting stuff here. The narrow neck of land, which is has an eastern and western sea, becomes the isthmus in southern Mexico, which has a northern and southern sea, which is a real stretch. Moroni carried the plates, so the final battles were still in Central America, but the plates were carried to New York. This is the one, horses are tapirs. Many of you would be raised. The white god legend of Quetzalcoatl, we were all taught that in church, that was the white god, that was Jesus Christ come from America. So that's now been ditched by the apologists.
Okay.
Seal of 5 was a representation of the tree of life.
That's been ditched?
That's been ditched, yeah. And there's just a whole bunch of other stuff. They're still hanging on to the horses. They're now claiming that there's horse DNA that's been found, but it's all very iffy. It's, the carbon dating can be out by 100 or so years, meaning that the horse bone that they're talking about is now post-Columbus rather than just before Columbus. So it's all very iffy, very unreliable evidence. So that's what I, straight away when I encountered the problems, they said, oh, talk to the apologists. So I started corresponding with the apologists, and this is what I was introduced to.
So just to confirm, this is the 98?
98, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I had no knowledge of this, but yeah, it just smacked of utter desperation. Just desperation apologetics to grasp at anything they possibly could. So scientists have been very busy in Mesoamerica. So exactly where the limit of geography is centred, they've now tested about 1,700 plus this 600, so probably 2,500 Native Americans have now been tested in the very region where the limit of geography is meant to be. And just a few lineages have been found, and they're African and they're European, but this is a very telling result. 2 papers published in 1 year, 261 Mayans were DNA tested, 259 had an Asian lineage, which is not even up for debate. They're clearly Asian lineages, and the 2 that weren't Asian were African. 0% were Middle Eastern DNA. So, when you get the few lineages which are not Asian, clearly Asian, from a mixture, yes, there's a little bit of room for hope. That these could be from the Middle East, but when the scientists drill down and do their work thoroughly, they find that they're not. They're clearly from Africa or from Spain or Portugal. So this is particularly damaging to the known geography guys. Here now we turn to the genomic DNA. This is essentially an ancestry.com type result. So 21 unrelated Mayans were tested, so the entire genome of each of those 21 was analysed for 700,000 markers all the way across the genome. And then they're able to identify being linked to any populations in the Middle East. It's all to close by Native American populations because they're very closely related, so they share many of these markers. But they're going over to Africa, North Africa, Spain, Portugal. It's exactly what you'd expect, Europe, and over here in Asia. So it's a really clear result. The other thing they can tell is that they can tell how long ago the European DNA came into these people's family history, and it was about 300 to 400 years ago. So it's not 2,000 or 2,500 years ago, it's exactly when we'd expect it to be. So to give you an idea of how sensitive this data is, if DNA had been present, Middle Eastern DNA had been present at 1 in 10,000 individuals in that person's family history, they could detect it. Okay? So we're now talking 1 in 10,000, that's 100 people in a million. I think, if I do my maths right. Is that right?
No, sounds good.
Yeah, 10 times 10,000 That's right, that's 100 people. Okay, so it's a extremely sensitive technology, and we're still not finding any evidence of Middle Eastern DNA. So I think that pretty much nails the limit of geography. The limit of geography, I'll talk a bit more about it later on, but that's enormously threatening to it. So now we turn our attention to the heartland geography. I think it's important to know that Rodney is not a scientist at all. He has no scientific training. He's a salesman. He might be. He's a lovely guy. Yeah, here he's fantastic. A lot of fun to be around. He's charismatic and he's a fun guy. But he doesn't know what he's talking about. He really. And as I mentioned, he was deeply disturbed by the DNA because he really didn't like the result, the explanations, and so. But he arrived on the scene when he thought there was a bit of controversy about the X lineage and its origins. In fact, the X lineage had been resolved about 10 years earlier on, if you looked in the literature, and scientists knew where the X lineage came from. At the time, they had not discovered an X lineage in Asia. They have since. But he also tapped into a very rich vein of this pseudo-archaeology in the Americas. Americans really want to believe, not all Americans, some Americans, want to believe that the lost tribes made it to America. It satisfies a deep need to be connected in with the biblical story. And he also is very nationalistic. If you look at anything that the Heartlanders present at their conferences, there's quite a lot of sort of American pride type sort of stuff. And so they really believe deeply that America is the promised land. Another thing that's not so obvious from what you see, I don't come right out and say this, but they are young Earth creationists. So Rodney Meldrum firmly believes the Earth is 6,000 years old. There was a flood. He believes that the flood results in carbon dating being inaccurate prior to the flood, but accurate after the flood. And that fits beautifully with what he wants to get from the DNA evidence. So it really is, it's very opportunistic with the way that he uses the DNA evidence. But lastly, this has been the most fascinating thing to watch, is that they're openly critical of the limited geography, and they literally despise each other. They've written very hostile stuff towards each other. So I'll just quickly run through this, but it's absolutely conclusive now that Native American X lineages are distantly related to other Eurasian ones. So this is the most common one, the X2A, and you don't find that in you just don't find that in the Middle East. They are related, and they came from the Middle East, but 25,000 years before Israel even came into existence, so it's largely irrelevant. And really the whole X lineage debacle is because we only have we don't have enough letters in our alphabet. If we had a few more letters, in the alphabet, there would have been more letters to resolve and distinguish these sorts of things and to break this lineage up, because it's by far the oldest and largest family of related lineages. So, but the other thing is that scientists, if you imagine a bunch of people moving into a new environment, as they pass on their DNA to their children, every generation new mutations are crop up, and they're passed down the generations, and so that enables scientists to build a family tree, if you like, using the DNA and they're able to then estimate how long ago, by looking at how much variation there is in existing populations, they can work out how long ago they had a common ancestor. Like if all of the X lineages in the Americas were identical, they could safely say, yes, they've probably only arrived about 300 or 400 years ago. But if they go out and they sequence all the X lineages and they find lots of these variations present, then they can safely say that yes, it's probably quite a few thousand years ago. So when they do the analysis with the X lineage, it's exactly the same time period that it arrived. So it came in with the original folks into the Americas. And in fact, if you draw a family tree, I won't go into all the detail of this one, but if you draw a family tree of, these are the ex-lineages present amongst Native Americans, and these are the points where they differ, the mutations. The Kennewick man, which is the earliest ex-lineage they have, appears right on this branch point. So Kennewick man, which I'll talk about in the next slide, I think. No, I don't. Oh, okay. Kennewick man's lineage is right here. I should go back and, yeah. So Kennewick man was a skeleton they found in a place called Kennewick, which is on the, I think it's in Washington State.
Mm-hmm. Eastern Washington.
Yeah, and it's right on the edge of the Columbia River. In fact, the Columbia River was eroding away, and the skeleton came out, and they dug it out. They did an awful lot of work on it, and it's about 8,500 years old. And it took a long time, it took about a decade, I think, to get permission to do the DNA work on Kennewick man. And when they analysed it, it was a lovely result. You couldn't have wished for anything better. He had the X lineage, and his X lineage was ancestral to all the ones today. It's exactly what you would expect. So, of course, this is all rubbish according to the Heartland people, because carbon dating is wrong, because the flood came along and mucked up the carbon dating. It's all very convenient, but sadly that is the truth. The X lineage came in from Asia. So I'm quickly going to run through a couple of slides that just talk about the true geography. I think it's always important to know the true things that happen. So here we have a place called Beringia. In fact, I might just quickly skip to the next slide. During the last, what ice ages do is they trap a lot of water in ice, and sea levels fall. Okay, it's well known, and when sea levels fall, they expose lots and lots of land. And here you've got Alaska, Siberia. This land was all exposed 20,000 years ago during the ice age. So, and it was quite mild. The temperature, they know the climate was relatively mild there compared to lots of other miserable places in North America. And they lived there for many thousands of years. And then when the ice age came to an end, there were some that were trapped in Alaska, and then they finally migrated down into North America. So the interesting debates at the moment are about where they migrated in, and I think the earliest now, I think there's almost a consensus now that the earliest migrations were along the coast. Because some of the very earliest archaeological remains in the Americas, which are pretty much widely agreed by scientists, are at a place called Monte Verde in South America. A long, long way from the Bering Strait, but it's just, and that suggests that they just, once they got in, they just got really quick, very rapidly. Only probably in less than 1,000 years they got down to South America. So after the Ice Age, there was a break in the ice sheets through central Canada, which they believe they also came in via. It's possible they came in along the east coast as well, but much more likely they came, well, they're now know conclusively they came via the Pacific coast. And of course, the Bering Strait has never been a complete barrier to migration of Eskimos. So Eskimos have still been paddling backwards and forwards across the Bering Strait over the last 10 to 15,000 years. Okay, this isn't talking to me anymore. No. There's something else, is it?
This one? You've already done this one?
Yeah, maybe I went. Going back's confused it.
This one?
Yeah, okay. So just a couple more slides, not too much more. So, there were other migrations to the Americas. They haven't found any clear DNA evidence, human DNA evidence yet. I think they will one day, which will be fascinating. But there's unambiguous evidence that the Norse arrived in Newfoundland 1,000 years ago. They almost know it to the day because they recorded it. They wrote it down, they've got these books and they recorded the travels. California, on the coast of California, they have two bits of technology, fish hook technology and boat building technology it suddenly appears and it's remarkably similar to Polynesian technology, which had been around for a long, long time. So almost certainly they got to California. They may not have stayed around, they may have just sailed straight back into the Pacific. And there's also clear evidence now that the sweet potato, which was very popularly grown in the Pacific, is from South America. And that's actually been confirmed recently with DNA. So there has been contact. There is a tantalising piece of evidence for the Norse contact, because they've found an individual in Iceland that has a C DNA lineage. You know, the 4 Asian lineages. The only problem is they don't have a C in Native Americans that matches that C lineage. It's different. So it's possible that it was just it's highly likely that if the Norse got to North America, that one of them took a native bride back to Iceland. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next decade they find, particularly using the whole genome analysis, that they'll stick out very clearly. They'll pick up that DNA. So I think this summarises relatively accurately what's going on at the moment. I think still for the vast majority of members, probably 90-95%, they still are pretty much oblivious to what's going on, and believe the hemispheric geography.
Sorry, just to clarify, hemispheric includes heartland and limited, right? Just like
It's the whole continent.
Yeah, whole continent. Yeah. It's like they were everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
And including the Polynesians. Just
Yeah. I mean that's. Yeah. Often in the criticism that they ditch on me, they use this sort of all or nothing. Okay, I'd be quite happy if it would be 30% Middle Eastern DNA, or 10%. That'd be okay. I didn't demand 100% of these folks had to be Middle Eastern. But I think there's a growing, now there's probably amongst the relatively informed members an acknowledgement that there were Asians there. But anyway, I think the essay completely refutes the hemispheric. That's gone.
the essay is limited geography, right? Essentially.
It's
or is it just like
they've charted a very careful course, because I think Rodney Meldrum would also be very comfortable and happy with what they've written
Right.
there.
Right.
They're just saying that it's hidden still, like it's diffused or something.
They're just sort of backed out.
That's
and
my
say,
next slide. I'm going to
Yeah.
talk about a little bit more detail. But the interesting things that have happened is that limited geography apologists have all been sacked from BYU. So basically, I think the church is saying we don't have any involvement in this debate. It's going to get messy. The heartland geography is growing rapidly. I think it's going to reach a climax and will then decline. But these guys hate each other. But what both camps I think are struggling with is they're not capturing the younger generation. So if you went to a heartland conference, you'd struggle to find anyone under the age of about 55, because they're all older members. Hemispheric geography, they're convinced that there's piles of evidence out there. But I think now what we're starting to see is some quiet acknowledgement from folks like Bushman and Masson that it's not as simple as it's been made out, so there are problems there. So in terms of the essay, this is what it acknowledges. It acknowledges that most of their DNA is Asian. It does that quite carefully and quite quietly, I would argue. This is a very common argument. We don't know what Lehi's DNA looks like. That is unimportant. That's irrelevant. It's a red herring, because we don't have any DNA that we don't know where it came from. If we had lots of DNA we don't know where it came from, then maybe that could be Lehi DNA. But all of the DNA, we know where it came from. So, but the other point is that we know Lehi's DNA would be Middle Eastern.
It's an Ephraimite.
Yeah, they're from the Middle East. They're Jewish. They're Hebrews. We know what Hebrew DNA looks like. It's well established.
But just to be clear, so the church sort of jumps on this. We don't know what Lehi, this individual, his DNA could have been totally different to everyone, right? That's their
From somewhere.
apologetic argument, right?
But this is from an era
Yeah.
when people moved less than a few miles from where they're born.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, exactly.
you're not going to get Asian
Yeah.
DNA just isn't found over there. So
Maybe Lehi was Chinese or something.
yeah, well, that's one of those.
That's where they're going next. Yeah.
The other argument they use, and this is where they get into the bottleneck effect or complicated scientific terms, population genomics terms, which are essentially what they're saying is that the lineage has become so rare that we can't detect it. But that's really quite problematic because the whole purpose, one of the major purposes of the Book of Mormon, and it was written by the prophets in the preface to the, I think it's either is it the introduction of the preface, I'm not exactly sure, but it was written by the prophets who wrote the gold plates. But the book was to redeem the Lamanites. It was to go to the Lamanites. Well, if we can't get the Book of Mormon to the Lamanites because we don't know where they are, it defeats the purpose of the book. So it's heavily focused on the limitations of DNA technology. The rising generation is going to find that really hard to swallow when they see the ancestry.com DNA results are coming out to some in the room maybe have their DNA done with ancestry.com. It's only about $100. 700,000 markers. That is just unbelievable, the amount of data that can be generated. And the younger generation, I think, instinctively knows that DNA evidence is very powerful, and they understand DNA a bit more than their parents. So I think that sort of thing is just going to just won't serve them well. But I think the other thing the essay does is it doesn't offer any alternative geography. Okay, you know, for almost 200 years we've believed this hemispheric story. Okay, now we've got to believe something else. What do we believe? And there's nothing really that's been provided. So this is what I refer to now as the vanishing geography. And this is what the apologists are arguing. They encountered large native populations, even though the book says that the land was preserved for them, kept from the knowledge of other nations. I've heard them argue that Native American populations didn't qualify as nations. This is even though there were millions of them.
Just throw them under the bus.
So they then argued that they quickly were assimilated into those populations and then ruled them for 1,000 years. Even after 1,000 years, these cultures, the Lamanites and Nephites, were referring to each other as their brethren. It just makes no sense if you're doing that when 99.99% of the people in that population are unrelated to people from the Middle East. It just beggars belief. So I've seen this argument as well. Native people were not mentioned because they were outside of the scope of the book. We didn't say, oh, there were a whole lot of native people that we'd never seen before over the hill, because it's just not important. But it also relies on this, and this is the most troubling. Everything the leaders have taught in relation to the geography of the Book of Mormon needs to be ignored for the last 200 years. And it also overlooks direct revelation from God, talking to Joseph Smith, who referred to the Indians as Lamanites, and to the Book of Mormon narrative as it's plainly written. Anybody reading the Book of Mormon without any knowledge of the colonisation of the Americas would reach the conclusion this is about a people that colonised the land and it was prepared for them, and they built massive civilizations. It's just, very, very difficult for some folks to swallow. But that's all they've got at the moment. So, just want to make a couple of important, this is my last slide. Native Americans are essentially all derived from people who migrated about 15,000 years ago into the Americas. They now believe that it might have only been as few as 100 people that came across. Okay, the X lineage, the reason we may not find it in Asia is it was probably rare, but it got a bump up in its frequency because it might have been rare in Asia, but once in that tiny colonising group, it might have been quite relatively common because it's compared to Asia, and so it's got a bit of a boost. The point I wanted to make is that you're going to hear over the next, there's certainly been plenty of these claims over the last few years, but there are going to be many claims over the next few years about oh, they found Middle Eastern DNA, but that will not change the facts that I've just given. Once you've found the closest relative is in Asia, there's no going back. Scientists aren't going to come on, oh gee, we made the wrong conclusion, that's actually Middle Eastern. It's simply mathematical. If there are many fewer differences in the DNA, just count up, between Native Americans and Asians as opposed to Native Americans and Middle Eastern populations, if there are many fewer differences, then they are more closely related. That is a fundamental principle now in modern molecular genetics, and it underpins research in many research fields outside of humans. So there won't be large or even significant amounts of Middle Eastern DNA found. They will find Middle Eastern DNA because Middle Eastern folk did migrate to the Americas after Columbus, but it won't be ancient, it won't have arrived earlier. So as I mentioned, there will be plenty of false claims that will come along. One of them is this recent one. It's these pests that are claiming Jewish DNA amongst the Cherokee. If you've heard that one, it's absolute rubbish. The guy that runs the business is a part Native American. He believes that he's a Cherokee, part Cherokee. He believes for many other reasons, and they're all complicated, believes for many other reasons that the Cherokee have Jewish ancestry, and there are a lot of incentives for Jewish, also Native American tribes to find a connection into the dominant narrative that's present in North America, and that's the Bible. So they want to get connected in. So this one will, hence incidentally that guy owns a DNA testing company. It's in his business interest to promote and stir the pot and get many people testing their DNA. Another one, and this one is quoted in the LDS essay. About a third of Native American DNA came from the Middle East, and it's based on a National Geographic journalist's report of a scientific paper. So it's a second-hand account. It's been blown out of all proportion. The individual that was tested, that had a third of their DNA came from the Middle East, was 25,000 years old. Okay. The person lived and existed before America and before Israel even came into existence. And somebody, you would actually expect somebody in Central Asia to have a sizable proportion of Middle Eastern DNA, because that's where their ancestors came from, 10 or 20,000 years earlier. So there'll be plenty more. But I think this is the thing to remember. It's not going to undo the facts that we already know. So I think that's it.
Cool.
So they didn't find self.